If you're looking for love, Jewish matchmaker and dating coach Judith Gottesman would be happy to help. She provides personalized coaching and matching for adults of all ages. Buy her 2 books, Your Soulmate Awaits and The Lost Art of Dating. She was just featured in an article on dating after 60 in the Forward. Go to her website for more info to see her press, dating tips and horror stories, videos, and read testimonials. Soulmatesunlimited.com. That's soulmatesunlimited.com. Enjoy the podcast. Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Okay, well, today we have a guest that I've been trying to get onto the podcast for a couple of months, and we'll see why in a few minutes. I'm here to welcome Izabella Tabarovsky. Izabella is a senior advisor at the Canon Institute, a scholar of both anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and a contributing writer for Tablet Magazine. Izabella, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be here.
So you wrote on, I believe, September 20th, an article that was probably the most impressive piece of prophecy. I don't know if you're calling it that, but I'll call it prophecy, that really I've seen in my lifetime, because you wrote an article, a long article about the cult of anti-Zionism, as you call it, about how American progressives, specifically on campus, are rising a new type of anti-Semitic ideology cloaked in the language of anti-Zionism. And you write this, I just looked it up, September 19th, 2023, which is, of course, 3 weeks before the Hamas attacks on October 7th. And I don't need to tell listeners, and I've recorded several podcasts about this since, the proliferation of not just anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, but of sheer glee for Hamas and supportive terror that we've seen. So I'm excited to talk about all of that. Can you give the listeners, and I'll link to your article in the podcast notes, but what prompted you to write that article? What sort of relevant background? Why did you feel before October 7th? You were probably writing this in July, August, September. What prompted you? What were you seeing that inspired you to write this?
Well, first of all, I've been writing about this now for a few years. I think that the first time I wrote about anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism, specifically the kind of anti-Zionism that we see on the progressive left, was in 2019. So it means that already in 2018, I was seeing this material and thinking about it. And what prompted me was precisely one of those news items where we saw students on an American campus somewhere. It was a TV program, where we saw students, American students, with the signs from the river to the sea and free Palestine, and Israelis are the new Nazis. And then they do that, and then they say, well, but we're not being anti-Semitic, we're just being anti-Zionist. And the reason it caught my attention is that I am an immigrant from the Soviet Union. I grew up in the USSR. We emigrated, we came to this country in 1990. And this is the kind of stuff that we used to hear back in the Soviet Union. And I remember calling my dad and telling him about it, and just completely puzzled. I was like, how is it? What is this? Why are we seeing it here in America? And I retell the story to him, and I say, and look, they say that they're not being anti-Semitic, they're just being anti-Zionist. And my dad just laughed out loud. He's like, yeah, we've heard this one before. And that's what started making me think, wow, we really have heard this before. And so I started doing research. I started looking into, and I'm a scholar of the USSR, and I started going to sources, and I started looking at what the USSR used to put out about Israel and Zionism, and I see the exact same slogans that we hear in America today appear already in the 70s and 80s in Soviet literature. Zionism is racism, and Israel is an apartheid state, and Israelis are the new Nazis. And so I started writing about it. And I think going back to this article, again, I had already written quite a lot. I had researched quite a lot. This piece, what prompted this specific piece, was this new institute that appeared in California, that's called the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. And I started reading its website, and I remember reading it and thinking, my gosh, like somebody needs to explain to people what this is about. We really need to specifically, this was the most detailed kind of expounding perhaps of this ideology. And so I just sat down and I started looking line by line. What are they saying? Why are they saying it? And what makes it so dangerous?
So when we're talking about Soviet anti-Semitism, or even before that, the sort of predecessor of Russian anti-Semitism, if you were going to sort of map this out historically, are we starting in the 1880s with the Pale Settlement? Do we start with Stalin? Where do you sort of think about this from a historical perspective? When are the seeds laid, and how did that end up morphing into anti-Semitism cloaked as anti-Zionism?
Well, when I teach this and I give a lot of lectures on the subject, I usually will start with the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which of course are a Russian product. And they are, of course, they are a product of very old Russian anti-Semitism. And I will often remind people that in the late 19th century, millions of Jews from the Russian Empire emigrated to the United States. And I think that most American Jews are descendants of that wave of Russian Jews from the Russian Empire.
Those are my great grandparents were.
I'm not surprised. And then you get into the Soviet. I get into the Soviet Union, and you have to understand that actually being against Zionism is a very old position. Lenin was argued against Zionism. Early Stalin, already before the Russian Revolution, he argued against Zionism. But these were different arguments from what we hear now. These were back then arguments that were actually grounded in Marx. And you can agree or disagree with them, and I disagree with them. I think it's a very narrow and it's a biased perspective, but it had logic to it. You could understand why somebody who considers themselves a socialist or a communist would oppose Zionism, and you can understand that they're looking at Zionism as it is. What happens over time is that the arguments against Zionism acquire conspiratorial perspective or a conspiratorial tinge, and they begin to sound when the Soviets argue against Zionism and Israel, they begin to sound as if they're rehearsing the tropes from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And of course, we know, and I'll remind the listeners, that anti-Semitism, what makes it different from other forms of hate is that it's grounded in a conspiracy theory, right, about the all-powerful Jews who control the world. Well, after 1967, and I'm sort of skipping through Stalin, Stalin is when it really begins to happen. But it makes, and I skip through Stalin only because we don't have much time and people can actually research it themselves. There's a lot that's been written about Stalin's anti-Semitism. But what people don't understand is that a turning point comes in 1967. And 1967 is the Six-Day War. And that's when Soviet Arab allies lose to Israel, right? These are big countries that the USSR, they financed and trade their military. And so the Soviets are really shocked that Israel wins. And they begin to they get into this connect the dots mode of thinking. And in any case, Soviet culture, political culture was always conspiracist. And so this is when, out of that loss of their allies, their Arab allies, which produced a major internal crisis in the USSR and a major crisis inside the communist bloc, out of that arises the need to prove to the world that Zionism is this sinister force. Zionists control the world, or they want to control the world. They're hostile to socialists. They're hostile to all progressive peoples of the world. They are in line with imperialists and colonialists and those who want to suppress the national movements. And also what arises out of this is sort of this glorification and this centrality of the Palestinian cause that the Soviets begin to kind of quote unquote sell to the global left and the developing world. So that's really where the turning point comes. And also that's when Soviet anti-Zionism begins to go global. Until then, it was an internal matter. And after 1967, they begin to translate their materials into dozens of languages and send them out to the audiences that they hope will share their perspective.
Yeah, and just to give our listeners a little bit of background, and you can tell me if you fully agree or you disagree with any depictions of this. in 1948, in the early years of Israel, Soviet Union actually backed Israel. Israel was seen as a example of successful socialism / communism on the global stage. And it really wasn't until the late 50s, but really early 60s, where America starts to back Israel more, that the Soviet Union ends up allying with the wider Arab bloc. And so are you basically making the argument, just to see if I understand this, to lay it out clearly for listeners, the Soviet Union and even pre-Soviet Union, just Russia, had this long legacy of anti-Semitism. You had noted the Protocols of Elders of Zion. Of course, even before that, all Jews in Russia were basically forced under this Pale of Settlement area that they had to live. And we know that there were frequent pogroms and conspiracy theories even pre-late 1800s in terms of, the Jewish tenure in Russia. And so the Soviet Union, when it was convenient for them on a global stage, back Zionism because this is a form of socialism. But the second Israel started allying itself with non-socialist allies, France, Britain, America, throughout the 50s and 60s, all of a sudden the Soviet Union almost dug up their old literature on anti-Semitism. Their anti-Semitism was conveniently cloaked in the language of Zionism anyway, because Protocols of Elders of Zion, again, I believe this book was written in 1903, 1904, or something like that. And so this
Exactly.
is, sure, in the early days of Herzl, but this is before Zionism was a big phenomenon at all. So for listeners that have never seen or heard of the Protocols of Elders of Zion, I implore you to spend some time Googling it and reading some of the excerpts, because this is not anti-Zionism. This is clearly anti-Semitism in the most nefarious form. And so the Soviet Union in the 60s starts to re-earth a lot of these conspiracy theories that, of course, are already latent in, the social fabric, and then begin to sort of propagate it to the rest of the world.
Know that they're using anti-Semitic tropes. They know it's anti-Semitism, and they're just trying to. So basically, it's a war against Jews. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, in the sense that I actually, after having read so much Soviet literature, propaganda literature, I actually believe that they believed what they said. And it's a distinction without a difference in the end, because Jews experienced anti-Semitism under this anti-Zionist rhetoric inside the USSR. But I do think that the Soviets believed what they were saying, just because they kept saying it so insistently. And this is that we're not against the Jews. We love the Jews. But there are some kinds of Jews that are unacceptable to us. And so here are the kinds of Jews that are unacceptable to us. Religious Jews are unacceptable to us because we're atheists in general. Zionist Jews are unacceptable to us because they're nationalist, and we are internationalist, right? As socialists, we're internationalist, and bourgeois Jews. So all the Jews who basically live like in America, and who are not socialist Jews, and even Israelis, they would make sure to say that, like, we are not against Israelis, we're just against their Zionist government. So if only Israelis gave up on their Zionism, then we would be fine with them. And so they were making these distinctions, and that follows from those early articles that you see by Lenin and Stalin in the early 20th century, from the kind of Marxist thought, Marxist-Leninist thought. But of course, and they would say, well, look, Soviet Jews are not like these kinds of Jews. Soviet Jews are different. Our Soviet Jews don't need Zionist protection. Our Soviet Jews believe that the USSR is their motherland, and they don't want to emigrate to Israel, and they don't need the support of American Jews who claim that they want to help them out, and they're not suffering from the absence of Jewish culture and religion. They're completely fine with it. They want to assimilate. So they're making these distinctions where some Jews are okay, but Zionist Jews are not okay. Zionist Jews are these hostile forces. And so, and again, it may be a distinction without a difference, but I feel like there is a political logic there that's built not so much on anti-Semitism for them as a state. It's not the logic of anti-Semitism. The logic is, the USSR, the logic is Israel is now, it's kind of a channel for imperialist influence in the Middle East. It's in cahoots with the with the United States, which is our biggest enemy, Cold War enemy. And there is this movement of Soviet Jewry inside, and that threatens internal cohesion. So there is a political logic on that level. But of course, when you look at individual biographies of people who produced this ideology, you really see that they were open anti-Semites, known anti-Semites, and that they were in creating the kind of the propaganda that would meet the political purposes of the Soviet Union. They did draw on the old conspiracy tropes, old anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes.
Interesting. And as you said before, the Soviet Union was famously against any religion. I mean, not just for Jews, but that obviously, you know, a huge repression of not just Jewish religion, but also of Jewish culture. I mean, you know, in a couple of weeks, people are going to be lighting their Chanukiahs for Hanukkah. Is that a religious act? Is that a cultural act, right? For some people, it's different, right? Some people are doing it because they believe God wants them to. Other Jews do it because that's what Jews have done for 2,000 plus years. And the Soviet Union obviously doesn't make a difference. So at a certain point, I mean, what you're painting is almost an irony. Okay, you don't allow any type of Jewish religious ideas. You don't allow any cultural practice. You don't allow any sense of nationhood and belonging. So what Jews are left with in the Soviet Union, and I believe, you know, is just a mark on their passport saying Jew, which is sort of the only way to actually express Jewish identity, which of course ends up hurting the Jews there, because when you have a legacy of, you know, generation after generation of systemic anti-Semitism, that's not really going to help. Do you have a sense what was life like for Jewish communities in the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s? And yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. You're exactly right in your analysis. And what happens is that, you know, this rabid anti-Zionist rhetoric comes in, and it's grounded in anti-Semitic conspiracy tropes. And by the way, I want to say that you're absolutely right that, and it's exactly what the Soviets are arguing, is that we're in general atheists. So what do you want from us? Of course, we're going to be against Judaism. We're against all religions, but they're against Judaism in a different way. And I think it is because Judaism is not only religion; it's also it involves Jewish peoplehood. And so when they start to oppress Jews and repress the religion, and then also repress the nationalism, then it reflects itself in every aspect of Soviet Jewish life. And so as this rhetoric begins to come in, Jews are perceived as a whole as being unreliable and potentially treasonous and potentially assets for the Mossad and other foreign intelligence assets. They begin to be pushed out of certain jobs are now closed to them. Especially jobs that have to do with, let's say, foreign relations, or that might involve foreign travel or contact with foreigners in general. So Jews are pushed out of these jobs, and therefore out of all of the educational tracks that might lead to these jobs. And this is something I experienced myself. I was really interested in being in studying foreign languages, and then eventually having a career that would involve working with other countries. And, you know, I was told, don't even try to apply for these kinds of educational opportunities, because you're just not going to get it. You're a Jew. You have that Jew noted in your passport. You know, there are well-known and well-documented cases of Jews being oppressed and repressed and kind of pushed out of various scientific fields. For example, in math, in Soviet mathematics, Jews, there's an article in Tablet describing how Jewish kids who wanted to enter the field of mathematics and study mathematics in college would be given different sets of problems, actually unsolvable problems, so that they could not solve them and so that they could not get passable grades to enter these fields. And Jews also could not be in kind of visible professions in television or in radio. There was a period in the 70s where all of them were pushed out because they were viewed as treasonous, you know, especially
this is, of course, sorry to interrupt you. This is, of course, based off of ethnic Judaism, right? We're not talking about Orthodox, you know, men with kippot on TV. This is anybody, probably mostly secular, right, without a lot of Jewish background, just because you had the J in your passport or Jew in your passport. you are forbidden.
Precise. Precisely. That's exactly it. And so it's always, the question of how did they know in the USSR that you were Jewish? It's a question that often perplexes Americans and American Jews. I remember I had to answer these questions a lot when I first came to this country. I would say, well, you would get taunted in the streets as a Jew. And Americans would say, well, how would they know that you're a Jew? You're not wearing any outward signs of being Jewish. And it was really, truly, like in a classic sense, based on the facial features. You see your quote unquote Jewish nose, and they know you're a Jew just because, they know these anti-Semitic caricatures. And so that would be really the definition. Like you would then get taunted. But yes, if you were, for example, trying to enter an institution of, a college or university, yeah, then they know from that notation in your passport that you are Jewish. And, it's the only thing that defines you as a Jew. We knew nothing of the Jewish culture, no, Hebrew, no Yiddish, completely assimilated, really, except for this one fact. I mean, assimilated and not assimilated. Assimilated in the sense that we were really brought up on Russian culture, and Soviet culture. And yet not assimilated because of this notation in the passport or in the internal document. Mm-hmm.
There's almost an irony there. I mean, this is an entirely different topic, so I don't want to get too off base here. But the irony is, 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union might have just completely been lost to Jewish history if it wasn't for the sort of pervasive anti-Semitism based on ethnicity. Because then, of course, most of those Jews, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, end up going to Israel. And we can talk all about how that affected Israeli politics in the 90s and 2000s. And, both the hardships that a lot of those Jews faced in terms of the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, oftentimes not seeing them as Jewish, and also how the Russian Jewry, changed politics in Israel, right? That's a whole other conversation for listeners. You can feel free to Google any of those. I wanted to bounce something off of you that, just talking to really almost thousands at this point of students and alumni and graduate students over the past couple of weeks about this. And oftentimes people ask me, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? And my answer is always along the same lines, where I say, no, not in terms of categories, right? I think it's a categorical error to say is equals, right? But what I then say is, what's more important than asking that question is understanding the anti-Semitic roots that foment a lot of extreme anti-Zionist fervor. I'm wondering if you agree with that distinction. What would you say? I'm sure you've been asked this question every time you speak anywhere. Yes. What would you say to the question of, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? Do you think it can, at least in theory, be separated? Or because of these roots, do you think, no, actually, maybe in some, Jewish writings in the 1920s, sure, yeah, they can be anti-Zionist without anti-Semitic, but in the 60s and 70s, and certainly in 2023, how would you tackle that question?
Well, it's basically what I say. I say that it doesn't have to be anti-Zionist, doesn't have to be anti-Semitic in theory, but in practice, it virtually always ends up being that. It's precisely because I believe of this influence that the kind of anti-Zionism that we're hearing being expressed on campuses today and in the American streets today is rooted in these tropes that come from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and come from Soviet propaganda that it built on these tropes. And so the vast majority of what we hear today is anti-Semitic anti-Zionism, or perhaps anti-Zionist anti-Semitism is a better term, because anti-Semitism comes in different forms. And what we're dealing with today, this is the latest evolution of anti-Semitism, and that's the anti-Zionist anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and you make an interesting distinction in your article that I don't know if this is your original distinction, but I've never seen it before until I read your work, where you are saying that we should stop calling it anti-Zionism as a hyphenated two separate words, but anti-Zionism all as one word, to show that this is not an ideology that is a normative ideology opposed to some real Zionism, right? The capital A hyphenated anti-Zionism is, okay, maybe in some ultra-Orthodox communities, you have a normative anti-Zionism, or maybe in some Jewish progressive writings in the 1920s and 30s, a normative anti-Zionism. But really what you're claiming is this new, all lowercase, italicized anti-Zionism is not an ideology that's opposed to anything that actually exists, that the Zionism that is imagined by all lowercase, italicized anti-Zionists is actually some conspiratorial view of something that doesn't exist. So you peg, right, similar to a Jews both in the Middle Ages and modern ages, where there's some, ideal type of the Jew that you then peg, everything that's nefarious. So in medieval Christendom, right, the murder of Jesus, and in modern, Eastern Europe, the collapse of banks and the running of the media, which of course, is always a farce, right? It's always some conspiracy theory. And you just, that has gone from being pegged on either the individual or the ethnic or religious Jews, and now has been pegged on the Jewish state. And so the anti-Zionism that's existing is very different than any actual arguments that I might have with my friends about, well, was Herzl right? Was he wrong? What about Jabotinsky and Ahad Ha'am? And what do we think of Rav Kook? Right? Those are all very important. I mean, those are the types of conversations and the education that I try to do in my class, right? Really trying to tackle those issues. And, somebody can be against Herzl and think that Herzl's political project was incorrect. Sure. Right. And we can agree on that. But what you're describing here is really more conspiratorial. Can you sort of connect the dots there, right? Do you think this is just a one-to-one connection of Jews 500 years ago were blamed for all the ills that happen in whatever European village when something went wrong, and now Israel is just blamed whenever something gets wrong on the world stage? Is it really that simple?
Well, I think at some basic level, it is that simple. Now, I want to make sure that I give credit where credit is due. That whole thing about how do we spell anti-Zionism, with or without a hyphen, that belongs to two British scholars, David Seymour and David Hirsch, who wrote separately and really explained kind of philosophically why that would be the case. And I agree with it because, as you say, when we say it's analogous to how, we stopped spelling anti-Semitism with a hyphen because we understood that, who are anti-Semites? They're not really against Semitism or Semites, right? It's a whole separate ideology that has nothing to do really with what Jews do or who Jews are or how they behave and how they think. It's a separate world, right? They imagine Jews as in their own kind of feverish imagination, in a way that really it doesn't describe actual people. And it's the same with the anti-Zionists of today that we see on campuses. I mean, the things that they say, the things that they imagine, are so completely removed from anything that Israel, the Jewish state, do, from anything that, I mean, the word they've redefined Zionism really, to after the Soviet Union. The Soviets really did it for them. They redefined Zionism, and took it away from its original roots and their understanding of what it was into that conspirological kind of entity, which, and sometimes you can actually, when you compare it trope by trope, you can literally see, I showed this slide at my talks where, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion used to talk about international Jewry, and Soviet propaganda talks about international Zionism. And, in the protocols, they talk about Jews controlling the media and the finances and the politics. And here we have Zionists controlling all of that. So in some ways, it corresponds really trope by trope. So yeah, in some ways, it is as simple as that. The anti-Semitism of 500 years ago really is the anti-Zionism of today.
Yeah, and it is one of those things that once somebody understands, right, there's a couple barriers that I think the Jewish community has to explaining this to the wider world. Now, I'm gonna preface what I'm about to say with I believe the historical irony, because I do, personally identify as a political Zionist, right? And I ultimately think Herzl was correct. And just to remind listeners, what Herzl taught was, or what Herzl wrote was that this Jewish question that was circulating throughout Europe of, one, what are the Jews? And two, how are the Jews going to be safe? Was not a religious question, was not an ethnic question, was not a social question, but was really a nation question. And so Herzl, to some extent, was a pessimist, right? To some extent, in the sense where he did not believe that anti-Semitism is something that was going to be able to be solved by different countries. Very similar to, say, the Black Panther movement, who, as opposed to Martin Luther King Jr., who had this idea of a colorblind society, right? And the Black Panther movement, or the current Black Lives Matter. I got in a lot of trouble a couple of years ago for writing an op-ed for the Forward titled Zionism is the Jewish Black Lives Matter. You can imagine that did not get a lot of praise from either Black Lives Matter folks or from more right-wing Zionist folks. But essentially, I agree with my argument, right? My essential argument was Black Lives Matter is a group of people, right? Whatever we think of the current Black Lives Matter movement, that aside, at least the sort of steel man of Black Lives Matter is a group of people saying there was systemic racism in America. We tried to change it through legal and civil means, right? With a universalist tint. That didn't work. So now we need particularist movements to raise up these specific communities. Okay, great. Read Herzl, right? It's the same thing in some sense. So I do inherently agree with Herzl's wider frame, but it's hard to explain to the average person because one, if Herzl was correct, it means that the rest of the world has this low level of anti-Semitism that's almost baked in. So the need for Zionism in the first place almost makes it impossible to explain anti-Semitism to, say, friends and students at a university who aren't Jewish. So that's just one irony there. The second, right, according to some view of Herzl, right, it's not even worth trying because, again, we've tried for thousands of years or to some extent. So why even try, right? My time is much better spent, working with Jewish students or working in some way to help the state of Israel than trying to explain to a bunch of, non-Jews, all of this back and forth. But the third that I find the most complex is this idea that you said before, and that any Jew sort of intuitively understands the fact that Judaism dodges neat categorization as an identity, right? Judaism is not a religion, it's not an ethnicity, it's not a nation, it's some weird mixture of all of them. And these words, religion and nation and ethnicity, these words were come up with 150 years ago by Protestant scholars in Western Europe, and then they try to label Jews, right? We've been around for thousands of years. We have terms, Am Yisrael. What does Am Yisrael mean, right? Is that a nation? Is that an ethnic? Is that a religion, right? It's sort of a mix. But explaining that to non-Jews, right, that Jewish identity is complex, right, and multifaceted, which means anti-Semitism is complex and multifaceted, right? It's just such a barrier to explanation. So I want to move us. I know that our time is getting short here. This is always the trouble with recording on a Friday, is that we have a strict sunset deadline here on my end. But what do we think? Let me ask two questions, because I actually had one other question before that. And then we'll get to possible solutions and see if we can end on some, optimism or solution-oriented question. We're sort of describing, this wider Soviet trend in the 70s and 80s. How does that get to the American academic elite to the point where I think you're in your article, just to pull it up, you're talking about how, scholars like Judith Butler are praising Hamas and Hezbollah not as terrorist groups, but as sort of social justice organizations. How does that happen? Is that just clever Soviet and then post-Soviet Russian propaganda? Is there something else happening there? I mean, how do intelligent people end up supporting Hamas?
Well, how intelligent people end up supporting Hamas is really the crux of the matter right now. The way the propaganda gets to the global left in the 70s and 80s is that there are multiple channels. I mean, here's what I believe happened is that when you look at how they delivered this propaganda to the global left in the developing world, you see that there were so many channels, right? And they tried to, they did it in multiple languages, in dozens of languages, bringing propaganda brochures and news and doing all kinds of work around this, educational work around it in, dozens of countries around the world. The Soviet academia was involved. So there were, Mahmoud Abbas's dissertation. If you look at the contents of that dissertation, which I also wrote about, it's completely built on Soviet anti-Zionist propaganda. That's 1982. When you look at what kind of materials they sent to be published around the world, from the United Kingdom to the US, to South Africa, you can see that it's always the same ideas. It's always the same messaging appearing over and over again. And so if you were, for example, a leftist, a devoted leftist in the 70s, and you were reading all of these journals, no matter where you were, and again, I just look at English, and there was Arabic and French and Spanish and Italian and every other language under the sun. whatever publication you turn to, you see this perspective on Zionism and on Israel. And I think it's really interesting to think about, because the left is not monolithic. The left is actually very diverse. There are very, very many shades of left. But within there is one unifying point, like there is one perspective on which they all agree, and that is this conspiracist perspective on Zionism and Israel. And it begins to emerge in the 70s, and you see it in the 80s, and you will see Trotskyite publications. Of course, Trotskyists hated the USSR, and yet their perspective on Zionism completely corresponds with the Soviet perspective on Zionism. They worked through embassies. There, I trace in some of my publications the way Soviet ambassadors worked or were tasked to work with local populations and local politicians and local media and local Jewish communities to communicate their perspective on Zionism and Israel. They tried to place articles in major publications. There is one in the New York Times where it completely communicates Soviet perspective on Zionism and Israel. So there were multiple channels. And so my perspective and my view is that essentially this view becomes part of the global left, to the point where if you join the left today, or certain parts of the left, right? Certain parts of the left, this is a perspective that you're supposed to assume, it's part of the package. And it's the only way I can explain it. I can explain such an almost exact correspondence in some of the tropes.
Yeah, and then you're almost forced to adopt. I mean, once you have these lenses, I mean, I think internally, I mean, I could imagine right now, and I'm the optimist in me is thinking that this is going to be some inflection point on the American, progressive movement or left, because I could imagine a lot of people right now are shocked at what their own organizations and institutions are putting out. I mean, the fact that on October 7th, and just to remind listeners, October 7th is before any Israeli retaliation in Gaza, right? So there's a whole other conversation to be had there about, collateral damage and the ethics of the bombing in Gaza, right? And that's a conversation that's very much worth having. Reasonable people might disagree there, so that maybe is for another podcast. But before Israeli retaliation, I mean, this is still when the IDF was scrambling and, Hamas was still running through villages, butchering children and, teenagers at a music festival. You already started to have different social media accounts and different, left-wing academic groups basically posting, this is, great anti-colonialist uprising, finally. And I'd imagine, I mean, there's sort of two things happening simultaneously that, I'm trying to work through in my head, where I'd imagine a lot of people were shocked by that, and a lot of people are shocked by that. At the same time, the wider propaganda of anti-Israelism in the world is clearly growing. And I think, we have apps like, TikTok and Instagram and a lot of nefarious actors, right? Obviously modern day Russia, who, one is in a lot of ways, Putin is just the, ideological continuation of, in a lot of ways, the USSR, but in other ways, they're obviously trying to detract on the global stage from what's happening in Ukraine. We have China, who's entered the mix, who's China's, obviously the owner of TikTok, but we know just from past American elections, China just tries to destabilize the West. So the way to destabilize the West is, convince a bunch of 20-year-olds to support Hamas. And, recently, Osama bin Laden, and, Iran is, trying to funnel money into the disinformation age. The Atlantic just wrote an article a couple of weeks ago talking about how not the government in India, who of course Modi is, that's a whole separate story, but different companies in India that are just perpetuating disinformation and then selling it to other foreign state agents who are then putting it into Instagram. And so all of these different groups, I mean, the wealth of both, I think, critical thinkers in a lot of these left-wing movements might have reached a correction point, but the overwhelming propaganda is something that is really stunning to see. I mean, I didn't ever think that it can get to this point. I don't know if, as an American Jew, maybe I've just been naive because, as I keep telling myself as somebody who teaches Jewish history and teaches anti-Semitism throughout Jewish history, the last 60 years of Jews living in America was the most unique period for Jews in all of history in the diaspora. And so in some sense, what I think and what students and even what, the generation before me think to be normal in America, that is completely abnormal. So as somebody growing up in the Soviet Union, you probably might have in the back of your head a little bit of like, well, of course, what were you expecting? But for me, just the sheer proliferation of of all of this, and people just sort of sleepwalking their way into just complete moral stupidity. I mean, I don't even know another way to say it. It's shocking. I don't know if you have anything to add there, and we can get to some solutions.
Well, I do want to say a couple of things. So first of all, I want to say, sometimes people ask me, well, were there any other influences on the global left? And of course there were. Of course, I talk about what I know, but the left, the Western left, had its own additional movements. Most of them were also based on Marx, but this is where my friend David Bernstein, who wrote Woke Antisemitism, is very, very good on that, in tracing other movements. Cynical Theories is another good book that traces that. So there are multiple influences that act upon the left. But it's just fascinating how the left continues to use the same rhetoric from the 70s and 80s. Now, I think that as to the current moment, I mean, what I've been thinking about, and that what continues to kind of pop up in my mind, is that the turnaround against Israel was so quick, right? And people were so quick to dismiss Israeli victims. And, there are so many people just really dedicating themselves to questioning what happened to Israelis and the rape of Israeli women. Like, these international organizations are completely ignoring this. And I think that the only way it could happen so quickly and almost so automatically is the only reason it could happen is because everything related to Israel and Zionism and Zionist Jews had already become so dehumanized, right? Like, if you look at social media before October 7th, this is something that I tried to ring alarms about as well. The demonization of Zionists was so complete. It's like a professor would never say, I want to see all Jews killed. But you could easily see a professor say, well, Zionists or Zios need to be murdered. So it's like a Zionist Jew is no longer human. And this is one of the things that anti-Semitic conspiracy theory does to Jews. It dehumanizes Jews, and it makes it possible to murder them. And so that's, dehumanization is always it presages murder and violence. And what we're seeing even in America today, we're of course not, we're already seeing Jews being killed, right, at demonstrations, and there was a death of this one elderly Jew whose name I don't remember now, but it's becoming permissible to kill Israelis and Zionists, and that's what's so troubling, And people would ask me a lot before October 7th. People would ask me, well, which anti-Semitism is worse, left wing or right wing, and for most people, they would assume many people would say, especially Jews on the left would say, well, the right wing and the far right extremist neo-Nazi anti-Semitism is much, much worse because they are armed and they're dangerous and they're the ones who shoot Jews in synagogues. And then I would say, yeah, but left-wing anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, anti-Zionist anti-Semitism acts in much more insidious ways, right? You dehumanize, you deprive Jews of possibilities and opportunities and influence and culture and religion, and Jews begin to hide. Of course, after October 7th, I think that question is resolved, but like anytime I would answer this question, I would also think to myself, yeah, but violence against Israelis was there all the time, right? By Palestinian groups, by terrorist groups, and that violence was always permitted. And now we see it with such clarity that I think that one thing that October 7th does is it just eliminates the question of, which form of anti-Semitism is worse. Well, you know what? They're all one. And they each feed into each other, and they support each other, and they strengthen and facilitate each other. And if October 7th hasn't taught us that, then I don't know what else could.
Yeah, 100%. And just two things to add there, and then I'll throw it back to you just to wrap it up, and you can add whatever you want. One, this idea that, progressives have adopted that, well, it's not Jews, it's just Zionists. It happened to be a worldview that 90+% of Jews agree with. I mean, it really reminds me of studying, the Inquisition in Spain, right? A historical topic I spend a lot of time thinking about and teaching about and reading about, where you can use the same argument to say the Inquisition was not anti-Semitic. What? They weren't against Jews. They allowed Jews to convert. They were just against the thing that 99% of Jews happen to believe, which is that they reject Jesus. And so, right, there is a form, and there's a comparison here where, to some extent, you could argue your way out of anything that's not Hitler being anti-Semitic, because, okay, Hitler was an anti-Semitic essentialist, right? There was something essential about the racial structure of the Jew. But for most anti-Semitism, or for most anti-anything throughout history, right, there always is a way to wiggle yourself around, right, in these arguments. And so that it's something that I think, right, for I think my listener count's probably 90% Jewish, although there are some non-Jews who are loyal fans and listeners. They're usually probably already on our side of the anti-Semitism battle here. But I would implore you, if you're in a conversation with a progressive or somebody on the left that's saying, well, it's not Jews, it's Zionists, say, try using this comparison to medieval Christendom. The other thing I would say is the irony of progressives. And again, if you would have asked me even a year or two ago, I mean, I've identified on and off as a progressive, again, just like my identity of somebody asks me, which Jewish denomination I am. And, well, it depends on the week and what I've read. And, if the last synagogue I visited was an Orthodox synagogue, then I'm not Orthodox. And if the last synagogue that I visited is a Reform, then I'm not Reform, right? Sort of just always this discomfort with categorization. So I feel the same way with politics as well. But progressives very correctly, I believe, they acknowledge that, say, in America, right, I used the Black Lives Matter example before, that if there's hundreds of years of racism baked into systems and based into socialization, that doesn't go away when the laws change. And so I believe that progressives correctly point out the fact that there is still systemic racism in America today, left over from a lot of systems that were set up in this country, even if, and this is the important part, even if most people in America today are not themselves racist. But they fail to see how that exact same logic applies to anti-Semitism. I mean, we've been living in a world that there's been systemic anti-Semitism baked into institutions, to systems, to politics, to culture, to religion for thousands of years. And yet, now that Jews in America, will say, happen to be, at least Ashkenazi Jews happen to be on average wealthy, on average, seen as white, all of a sudden what? Anti-Semitism, disappears, right? So it's a complete failure to be logically consistent that really troubles me among progressives. So I'm going to throw it back to you. I don't know if you have anything to add on that, but I'd love to, get some concluding thoughts. Are there any solutions, right? Do you find any way forward, or does the Jewish community just have to sort of keep their head down here? And
Well, I think you made a really, really good point of comparing what progressives say about institutional and systemic racism and completely ignoring that argument on the side of anti-Semitism. There are people who are also on the left. I really like it when leftists make this argument, because then it sounds it's much more credible. They're the ones who criticize us from the inside. So there are people who perhaps could be called sort of classical Marxists, right? Socialists in that kind of classical sense, who have argued that this kind of demented anti-Zionism is going to ruin the left. It's going to bring the left to a point where it will no longer be able to distinguish its own position from the extremist right-wing position on the Jews. And that will impede the left from taking the kind of actions that are consistent with the left, in its fight for justice, etc. And I believe that we are precisely at that point right now. I mean, the moral collapse, the inability to tell the right from wrong, the inability to condemn crimes and rape. I keep talking about that because that's just such a prominent feature of the culture on the left, right? The progressive culture condemning sexual violence. Being unable to condemn it in the case of Israel, it's a complete moral collapse, in my view, of the progressive movement. So in terms of solutions, I mean, look, I think it's a well-known kind of truism that you can't really solve, or you can't solve anti-Semitism through education, people would say, in the sense that you can't change an anti-Semite's mind by telling them the correct facts or the correct history. And it has to do with the fact that it is a conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theories are notoriously self-sealing. That's the term that scholars would use. A conspiracy theorist prevents, it's a bubble, it's a perfect bubble. And nothing, no counterfactual, no argument against the conspiracy theory can penetrate that bubble. They somehow rework every counter argument into only strengthening the conspiracy theory. But so I think that our task should be, as a Jewish community, is to use education and direct it at those who are not yet at the extremes, to prevent those who are not yet there from crossing that barrier. And the message that I really try to communicate these days is how important we have to understand that it's not left-wing Jews against right-wing Jews. It's not liberal Jews against conservative Jews. It's all the Jews in the center against the extremes. And so, we have to stop dividing ourselves and making it so easy for anti-Semites to divide us. Liberal Jews have to work with conservative Jews. We have to strengthen the middle against the extremists, because the far left and the far right, their arguments and their ideas about Jews are the same. They use the same tropes. They may use slightly different terminology, but the idea is the same. And so we have to be educating people about the history of anti-Zionism, so that we understand it. We understand how it works, so that we understand what makes it so dangerous. We have to understand the difference and teach the difference between criticism and demonization. That's something that I find is very, very, people use the term criticism very loosely. When somebody is clearly demonizing Israel, a New York Times will still say, well, that's a critic of Israel. Well, it's not a critic of Israel. It's somebody who demonizes Israel. It's a conspiracy theorist. So I think we have to be clear on that distinction, and just strengthen the center.
Yeah, well, Izabella Tabarovsky, thank you so much for coming. And just one last question. If listeners want to follow your work, should they look through Tablet? Is there any other way in which people should follow you on any social media or anything like that?
People can follow me on Twitter, Iza Tabaro. That's my handle. I mostly do write for Tablet, and so if people subscribe to Tablet, then they're likely to see my work there.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming onto the podcast.
Thank you for having me.